And today we're going to focus on an amicus brief that the Attorney General of Tennessee submitted, where WPATH, which is the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, is a big player, as is Rachel Levine, who is in the Biden administration, who is, from what we can tell, an autogynephilic man who, unquote, identifies as a woman. Rachel also has a starring role in this amicus brief, which basically unmasks WPATH as basically an activist ideological organization in the trappings of medicine.
Yeah.
We're going to go into the amicus brief that unmasks, in our mind, WPATH, as well as the corruption between them and the Biden administration through the office of Rachel Levine. So, WPATH is the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. Doesn't it sound professional?
I love their logo.
Yeah. It's very scientific and very medicine-y. And look, it's pink and blue. What could be wrong? So, transgender health. This assumes there's something called transgender materially,
Yeah.
biologically, that requires a separate specialty and menu of pharmaceutical and surgical interventions. No,
Right.
I was saying another one of the
Right.
contradictions is that sometimes they want, oh no, it's a gender identity. It's an innate sense of if you're male or female or both or neither. And it's very much like a spiritual, metaphysical type of thing that's supposed to override the
Right.
material body. But then you have all this, you have the psychology, no, gender dysphoria. Oh my God, it's so debilitating, blah, blah, blah. And then you have
Right.
the medical part of it, which is, well, if it's innate, spiritual, metaphysical, why does that involve pharmaceuticals, surgeries, all this legal
Or iatrogenic
apparatus?
conditions.
It's just like, what is it? You know? It's not like you have Christian care or
Right.
Scientology care or goth
Right.
care or hipster care.
Right. Well, I'm sure they would try to monetize that if they
Right.
could.
So what we're going to dive into now is what should be a huge controversy in terms of the world of quote unquote transgender healthcare, gender affirming care, or whatever it is, gender pediatric surgery. Can you imagine there's such a thing as a gender pediatric surgeon?
It's terrible.
And so there are standards set by WPATH, the World Professional Association of Transgender Health. So standards of care is a set of guidelines that are widely adopted and referred to by doctors and medical clinics, etc., who quote unquote provide care to transgender to gender people, which has no coherent material definition.
Right.
But recent legal cases have revealed some really troubling claims about how these guidelines came together, how scientific they are, and really if this association is fraudulently presenting itself as based on science and medicine when it's actually more ideological and political.
Right.
So, what happened is there's an Alabama amicus brief, and an amicus brief is basically somebody that can write an amicus brief to a court if they think they have something that the court should want to hear or needs to hear that maybe the other people involved in the case aren't presenting. Alabama had banned the quote unquote gender affirming care stuff for minors. And throughout their case, they discovered some troubling issues with WPATH that gets cited all the time about standards of care and really is intricate in affirming and making it seem like there's something material and objective that would require this medical apparatus and treatments when actually perhaps it's, pure
Yeah.
ideology, bordering on theology. So anyway, Alabama filled out this amicus briefs to be like, FYI, here's what we found during our case in defense of this ban of these experimental procedures. I will add in the video description later the link to the full amicus brief from the Alabama Attorney General's office to the Supreme Court because it's quite long. But basically, the gist is that WPATH is more a product of ideology and political maneuvering than anything that anyone would call scientific. One of the things that becomes clear in the amicus brief from the Alabama Attorney General's office is that you have a lot of political manipulation behind these guidelines for so-called transgender care. It was influenced not by science, but more by political pressure, especially from certain US government officials. According to Alabama's brief, Admiral Rachel Levine, the Assistant Secretary for Health, regularly communicated with WPATH leaders. At one point, Levine reportedly pushed WPATH to remove age limits for various gender, quote unquote, gender affirming surgeries to avoid restrictive legislation. The brief even quotes one of the members saying Levine was very concerned that having age restrictions will affect access to healthcare for trans people. And he asked them to remove them. And for those who don't know, here
Snores.
is Admiral Rachel Levine, who is male, has a wife and kids. I don't know if he's still married to his wife or not. Then decided that he had to be the woman he always was. Came out as a quote unquote transgender woman. So, sex mimic, allegedly. And this is the person who is the point person, apparently, between the US government and WPATH. That's who Rachel Levine is. And Rachel Levine was like, no, no, let's take out the age restrictions. That's going to cause
Oh,
problems.
right. And we know that Genevieve Gluck and Redux found all of these, can I say this word? All these nasty pedophile forums on the WPATH. I'm just not accusing him, but people should read Redux and Genevieve Gluck's work.
They want to
They
say that eunuch is a gender identity. A eunuch is a castrated man. Of course, gender affirming bottom surgery for males is castration. This is another contradiction. So, if a man goes in and gets bottom surgery and gets his penis taken off and has some sort of fake vagina curated for him and has his perineum line with his former penis, whatever, I don't know. Anyway, we can't call that a eunuch. No, that's a quote unquote trans woman. I mean, it's
Right,
just the linguistic foolery is, but language, obviously, that's our software, people. And even when it first sounds crazy to you, if you keep on hearing it, especially if you hear it from places and people who have the aura of authority, it starts to be like, oh, okay. You got
right.
people now who think that there are some humans who are literally transgender, or
Yeah.
or they think that you can actually transition.
Yeah.
That the that the products provided by these people are good enough to really, you come out the different sex.
Yeah.
That's a separate issue, the pedagogical level. So,
These
for those of you who saw What is a Woman by Matt Walsh, Marcy Bowers is one of the head honchos, and I think maybe one of the people who started WPATH.
He's certainly influential. He did Jazz
Yeah.
Jennings's
So the World
surgery.
Professional Association of Transgender Health and Marcy Bowers, who is a male, does a lot of, I think, might be the person that's in the most quote unquote gender surgery. Again, I defy you to find on the human body where the gender is, but that's another issue. So this is who is really, I don't know. Anyway, Marcy is part of WPATH. I think maybe from the beginning. I'm not sure. And again, this is what Marcy used to look like before. He's probably had all the work done. I don't know, but like the facialization surgery and the trimming of the Adam's apple and the moving the hairline, I think that he has had it all done. Who knows? Anyway, so the removal of age limitations. So here's a quote from the brief that really underscores how political goals were steering the so-called medical recommendations. WPAP initially told Levine they couldn't just, we can't just drop the age minimums, citing a review process. But Levine's office kept up the pressure and eventually WPATH removed the age limits entirely. This led one member to admit, I don't know how I feel about allowing US politics to dictate international professional clinical guidelines. And again, the stuff that they're presenting in this amicus brief is what came out during discovery and their trial for a
Right.
similar thing in Alabama. Hmm. So yeah, I don't know how I feel about US politics dictating professional clinical guidelines.
Wow.
It's just kids' bodies and minds. La, la, la. And of
They
course,
have
I
a
would say
talent.
that if you have people like this, yes, and people like this, I think it's worthwhile thinking, why are they so interested in quote unquote trans kids and gender affirming
Right.
care for kids? Could it
Right.
be that it affirms their quote unquote gender identity? Yeah.
Totally.
So
Totally.
if this is something normal, natural, whatever, even though it requires all this medical intervention, we'll leave that contradiction to the side. If they're like this in middle age, well, I was probably like this from the beginning. Too bad I
Right.
couldn't have had all this
Totally.
fantastic stuff. So it makes sense that if you want to really push gender ideology, there's something as
Right.
gender identity that overrides or can not align with somebody's sex, and it's more important. Blah 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 blah. You have to do all this stuff. Then of course you're very much invested in bolstering this notion of the trans kid and gender affirming pediatric
Yeah.
care.
Right.
Because if that falls apart, then it leads to questions about all of it. Yeah. Especially
Right.
because there's all this confusion. Okay, it's an innate sense of self. No, it's a mental health issue with gender
Sure.
dysphoria. No, it's not. It's this and that, but yet we have to have all this stuff to rearrange everything.
These guys are
Sure.
brazen liars. Like,
Yeah. So the anchor is law, of course. So you codify this crazy stuff in law, and then you focus on the quote unquote, oh, poor trans kids,
right.
which means transing kids, but whatever.
Right.
I would just put that out there that it's not for nothing that these men who went through their whole life, male puberty, got married, had kids, and then later on, in later on, decided to quote unquote transition to perform their
Yeah.
female persona full time, now are very interested in this issue and don't think there should
Yeah.
be any age restrictions.
No, what it's oh, not only that, that's totally true. They love their origin stories, right? The big
Yeah.
liars. They love their origin stories, but it also makes so much more money. So much more money
Mm.
for, I guess, big pharma. Think about it. They start young, it's just ka-ching. And then you also have these bad men who are invested in the idea that people look like children forever, right? The Redux and Genevieve Gluck's investigations of the WPATH, they found all the bad stuff that we don't want to talk about. So, yeah, so there's lots of layers to this craziness. When I was a new turf, it was really confusing. Like, why do they want to do that? I don't get it.
We're so
I think
naive.
first I
Yeah.
heard from Julian Vigo, who was saying, they need to do this to establish their own credentials.
Mm.
As
It
born this
bolsters
way. Oh, I've always been a little
yeah.
girl.
No, it bolsters this niche male sexuality or sexual kink or whatever you want to call it. Oh, these poor kids, if only when I first started to dress up in my sister's clothes, if only I had this avenue. You know, it's just projection. So they were concerned about having US politics dictate international professional clinical guidelines around so called gender affirming pediatric care. So they also talk about evidence suppression and conflicts of interest. So it's not just the politics at play. Alabama's brief claims that WPATH knowingly avoided conducting rigorous evidence reviews, especially for pediatric care, precisely because the evidence was weak. Instead of admitting this, WPATH chose to keep things vague to avoid what they saw as, in quotes, an untenable position in terms of affecting policy or winning lawsuits, end quote. So yes, they made a strategic decision not to dig into the science because they were worried the science wouldn't hold up.
Shocking. The
Again, let's put up this.
professional, world professional, yeah.
Yeah. So, World Professional Association for Transgender Health. I wonder if there's any clarification about what you can name it and what you can't name it. Because it
Huh,
really, you're like, oh, so it's world professional. So you would think psychiatrists and surgeons and other medical doctors, you would think maybe that. But
right.
professional association, you have some rando sexologists in here. You probably have some gender studies people. And then of course, you have the quote unquote gender surgeons who happen to be, you know,
Right.
tricked out. So have their gender kit. Yeah, there's all this presumed or aesthetics of knowledge and evidence and authority that seems to be applied erroneously.
Yes.
Okay, so let's see. The brief goes for alleging serious conflict of interest among the contributors of the standards of care. According to the document, Many of the authors have a direct financial stake in so-called
Ah,
gender funding treatments. Again, let's check out Dr. Marcy Bowers. Let's put this up here because this is the front page of the amicus brief that we're basing this segment on. And I'll just read it out because it might not be clear. This is the petitioner. This is Jonathan Skrmetti, Attorney General and reporter for Tennessee et al. And this is a brief of Alabama as amicus curiae supporting state respondents. And the person whose name is first on this amicus brief is Steve Marshall, who's the Attorney General of Alabama. Okay, so moving on. Dr. Marcy Bowers, for example, made more than $1 million last year from providing quote unquote transitioning surgeries. And yet, WPATH didn't consider this conflict worth disclosing. You have this organization that's put itself out there as being like the gold standard of quote unquote gender affirming surgeries or care, whatever they're calling it,
right.
and basically providing standards of the care that Dr. Bowers provides and makes money off of, and who also says he's a trans woman. Yeah.
Well,
Anyways, but no
they
big, no
said
biggie. That doesn't need to be disclosed for people who are using this as, oh, look, we have these standards. They cite WPATH. Well, WPATH says this, so we're just following the standards of care
right.
set out by WPATH.
They
We're
just made
just,
up themselves.
oh, right. In fact, one contributor admitted everyone involved in the standards of care process has a financial interest or a character interest, reputational interest.
Eh, Humanitarian interest.
Yeah, this
No,
is a
that's
crucial
not on
point.
there?
Yeah, yeah. This is a crucial point. Even though the brief states that conflicts were known internally, they declared no conflicts of interest were deemed significant or consequential in their standards of care that they distribute globally.
Such bald-faced liars. I don't know why I'm surprised anymore. Just
There's been like a media blackout on this for the last 10, 12 years or whatever. So none of this gets any
okay.
scrutiny.
No,
And the
really.
scrutiny it does gets demeaned as, oh, it's right wing, or they just hate, they're just transphobic, or they're whatever.
Yeah,
So it looks like it wasn't vetted, very little vetted internally, very little vetted legislatively, and extremely unvetted media wise.
right.
Yeah. Because all you hear about in the media is, oh, they have these great stories
Right,
of
the origin
transitioning and
story.
how they overcame this and they came out as what they always were. And then we have the
Feel
movies
better.
like with Will Ferrell showing us, oh, look at how great he is, modeling how we should be. Your friend of
Right,
30 years tells you that he's transitioning to be a woman and he's Harper now. And isn't it great?
right,
But whenever there's any pushback, it's framed as a anti-trans. For example, when people say, look, it's not a good idea. Bodies play sports, not gender identity, whatever that is. So we need to protect
right.
women's sports. Oh, it's anti-trans.
Let trans kids
And
play sport.
yeah, why
No.
they don't want them to play sports. They don't want this and that and the other. So it's unsurprising that so much of this stuff has gone under the radar for so long because it's shrouded in the rainbow flag. It's
Yeah,
shrouded as being affirming, as being accepting, as being kind, as being a
right,
civil rights issue, as being all this kind of stuff.
right.
And it's based on nothing material. It's all subjective and ideological and incoherent, but makes a lot of people a lot of money and
Yeah.
affirms opposite sex or non-binary personas in law to the point
Persona
that you could get in trouble if you don't follow all these new big sister protocols. Yeah.
brazen. They're brazen liars. Brazen is the only word I can it's just amazing.
So let's
Incredible.
see if it gets any worse, shall we, Tanya?
So
So the WPATH is riddled with conflicts of interest, but when they put out their standards of care, they say no conflicts of interest were deemed. That's an important word. So they decided for themselves if there was any problematic conflicts of interest that need to be declared. Well, that's handy.
oh, they're taking care of business. They're being so thorough. Is
Yeah.
this a problem? No, we love it. Okay.
No worries. Yeah. So what we're seeing here, it seems, is a framework for healthcare guidelines that's incredibly compromised. What influences the least is quote unquote the science for obvious reasons, because there's two sexes. There's no scientific basis in gender identity
Right.
or gender.
Science
Unless
would
you're
say
using it as a
that's not.
synonym for sex. Sorry. Go ahead.
I was just thinking maybe science would have something to say about having your genitals rearranged surgically.
Because it's reducing distress. Yeah.
Uh,
If you're dysphoric, which means unhappy about
right.
your female body, if you're a woman, or your male body if you're a man, or you have a bad feeling, and so what they're doing is reducing that bad feeling. Ergo, it must be somehow good, scientific, etc. Yeah.
You know what? I
So
have a friend who's a wound care nurse of like 30 years. She's a total pro. She's nice to the gender people, but she was telling me that she sees a lot of young women who've had the surgery who come in peeing like out of 4 places because of their
of
ruptured.
course.
So I guess feeling sad is worse than peeing out of 4 places.
Mhm.
Don't
And we
feel
know a
sad.
common problem for the guys. So guys, tuck, don't cut. Because a lot of the guys who go through the bottom surgery complain of anal leakage. So apparently the lining, I don't know, between the perineum and where the poop comes out of, there's seepage. So your fake vagina smells like poop.
Right.
Poop has never come out of my vagina.
God, no. Can you imagine? The boys
3 babies have,
who've
but
had the puberty blockers, so they have micro penises, so their penises never grow to adult length. So they don't have enough tissue to make a Frankenvag, so they have to use part of the colon, and that also smells bad. At least
yeah,
they're not feeling sad at night, right?
yeah,
At least they're not dysphoric.
it's a
That's
different, you're not worried about that anymore. You're worried about infections and
thank you,
weird
science.
smells and having to
Mm,
dilate. Anyway, but fortunately,
right.
most men who claim that they're women don't go in for the full package, the full gender kit. Anyway, they were shaped by the very people benefiting from the procedures being recommended, which is saying it's corrupt. If this is supposed to be impartial and just out looking out for the best care for the gender people, gender youth.
Fighting dysphoria.
So another point that comes out quite clearly in Alabama's amicus brief is the distinction between consensus and evidence. So the
Right.
WPATH's standards for care guidelines were supposed to be based on systematic reviews and the grade methodology, a widely respected framework for evaluating evidence quality. But according to the amicus brief, WPATH didn't adhere to that. Instead, what most of the standards of care is based on is consensus. And what this means is the authors agreed on the recommendations. They weren't derived from the evidence,
Right.
peer-reviewed clinical evidence. No, the group of people who comprised WPATH, they decided. There was
Right.
consensus among them who provide these quote unquote services. They decided what the standards of care should
Who better to decide? That's I ask you.
be.
Who better? I'm sure science approves. They had science on their side. Science was
Yeah.
talking to them. It's
Yeah. So
shocking, isn't it? Like,
so
you're
the
laughing, but
state is
it's actually
basically admit,
shocking.
but if you're not in the
Right?
know and you're reading this thing and you're thinking, okay, medical professionals, psychiatric professionals, and they say, here are the consensus guidelines, you're gonna
Right.
think that it's based
Of
on the clinical evidence. Yeah?
course.
You're not gonna think, "Oh, they just got around a table with some donuts and coffee and said, 'Yeah, that's good.'"
No kidding. And then this is also
Age limit?
what all of
No.
these magazine fake doctors have been spreading and fighting women with. Oh, Scientific American.
So, to illustrate this, the brief reveals that the Standards of Care 8 adolescent chapter, many recommendations were given a strong rating even though the evidence was weak. The adolescent chapter notes that a key challenge in adolescent transgender care is the quality of evidence. Yet later, they push forward strong recommendations for treatments targeting adolescent transgender quote unquote people. So, in one part, they say the quality of the evidence is weak, yet we recommend these procedures.
Right. It's shocking,
And
really
this is
shocking.
giving kids puberty blockers, cross
Yeah.
sex hormones that are
Right.
not reversible. What the evidence does suggest is that once you do that, the likelihood of them going on carrying on through this to the point of
Oh,
having
yeah.
lots of surgeries
Sure.
becomes much, much more. Yeah. So first you
course.
say, okay, yeah, Johnny is Jane, and you decide, okay, we're going to socially affirm. So we're going to call him
Right,
by a girl's name, and we're going to change his pronouns, and we're going to let him dress like a girl, and we're going to
right,
expect the school to go along with this, and our neighbors and everybody. And then,
right,
of course, then that makes it easier. That solidifies in the mind, and then the puberty blockers become more likely. Cross-sex
right.
hormones become more likely. And then once you've done that to your kid's body,
Yeah,
if you long enough time, their reproductive system doesn't go through puberty. And it's not just your reproductive system that goes through puberty, your mind is also changing,
they
you
stop the
know?
brain growth too with chemotherapy drugs. Puberty blockers are chemotherapy drugs.
So of course this raises the obvious question. If guidelines are so evidence light, why are they being treated as gospel in courtrooms and clinics? Why
Yeah,
is WPATH so intent on hiding this weakness?
yeah,
They have to know that this is psychological and subjective.
totally.
And whatever they convince
And
themselves. So it's the right thing to do to affirm and to offer all these services, even though there's no hard evidence to
right,
support doing so.
right. And you think that they would all be wealthy enough, all of these surgeons and clinicians of all kinds, but they're supporting a whole industry, right? They're also supporting the poet who writes poems for elementary school kids and makes coloring books of trans women in your community. Like they're supporting a whole industry. So it's not don't think that these guys are selfish. They're not. It's a trickle down. It's a trickle down thing.
Yeah, there's a lot of ins and outs and what have yous with the gender industry, which is so funny because you remember that it was a woman who was like, no one uses the word gender industry. What are you talking about? That's stupid. And I'm thinking, well, what would you call it? If it walks, talks, and acts like an industry, it's an industry.
Doubt. I think Jennifer Billick calls it the gender industrial complex for sure. Maybe gender
Hmm.
medical industrial complex.
Yeah.
Like on par with the military industrial complex, that kind of thing. It's a big rigmarole.
So again, the big thing about this is that these guidelines are evidence light, and what's coming out now is actually what there is evidence of is the detriment, the downsides of these procedures rather than the upsides of them. But it's being treated as the gospel in courtrooms and clinics. So why are they hiding this weakness? Well, if you've
Right.
been touting all this stuff, you don't want it to come out. You want to keep it going.
Right.
So the self-referencing and international skepticism. So lastly, Alabama focuses on what they call the circularity of evidence and WPATH standards of care. So they cite their own previous guidelines as evidence.
Yeah.
So this
Totally.
is the eighth rendition of the standards of care, and they will cite previous editions as evidence as support of the standards of care that they're suggesting now.
And I'm just looking at those 3 circles in their logo. It's perfect.
Yeah.
It's them telling on themselves. They can't help it. It's Duper's delight. Make
Yeah.
3 circles with 3 penises. One of them is piercing the brain of the poor woman who's standing down there.
Yeah.
God,
Literally gender borged.
yeah, no kidding.
So they cite their own previous guidelines as evidence, which were then referenced by other organizations, only for WPATH to reference these groups' works in turn. So they have their standards of care. Somebody else references their standards of care. They reference the article that referenced their standards of care as evidence
Right,
to support their next round of standards of care.
right. Perfect. It's neat. There's no neater shape than a circle. It's nice. Well self-contained and organized and moves,
Yeah.
moves along. It's
Uh,
nice.
so it's not just Alabama that's sounding the alarm. Internationally, countries like the UK, Sweden, Finland are taking a much more cautious approach to pediatric gender care. And isn't it
Right.
amazing that from the beginning there wasn't a cautious approach?
Yeah, it's
That when this
shocking.
whole thing was launched, gender care, it just kind of trickled along. And now
Right,
it's like, oh, maybe we should approach this cautiously. You think?
right.
We can't assume that there's good people manning the ships.
Oh, no, no. What's that awesome quote? "Don't assume that people are gonna understand things when their job depends on them not understanding it." That's not right. That's
Yeah,
not the right quote, but
yeah,
it's that kind of you know. Can you
yeah.
imagine some nurse at Karolinska Hospital going, I don't know, doctor," you know?
Yeah,
Give
we
this
should cut
child
off the
chemotherapy
breasts.
drugs,
Yeah.
right?
But they'll feel better. La la la. Okay, so The Cass review in the UK, which Alabama references, found that evidence base supporting pediatric gender transition is lacking. Then why were they ever doing it? I mean, it's just the most amazing thing. I don't maybe
Right.
I can't believe I'm still this naive. I don't know. It's one thing if it was adults only. So these people like Marcy Bowers and Rachel Levine who do all this stuff starting in their 30s or 40s or whatever. But kids,
Shocking. It's too
parents who look
disgusting.
like they're so happy they took their kid to be trans. I don't know what's going on there.
No, it's too shocking. If they'd ever said, "This is gonna be a really dumb idea, but these men are totally fetish driven. They need to do this to, to have a sexual life, and that's really important." Then at least they would have been honest, and parents wouldn't be
Yeah.
like, "Oh, my kid's gonna be great." But they lie
How
about it,
great I
right?
thought that you could only have a boy or a girl. I didn't know you could have a boy that turned into a girl or turned into a boy.
Yeah,
This led the National Health Service to limit certain treatments for minors. You think it would lead them to limit all of it. You have these severe interventions that aren't
right,
based on anything solid at all, that if anyone thinks about it without the gender Borg and the gender speak and the big sister in your mind, you're like, "What?" But yet, even
yeah,
when it starts to come out how this isn't evidence-based at all, the fact that it doesn't really do much to alleviate what it's supposed to alleviate anyway, this
right.
distress, generalized distress, but even then, they don't pump the brakes on it, they just, "We'll add some guidelines."
Well, there's still a lot of people who should know better saying things like, "Some children will benefit for" no,
The true versus fake gender identities, I should say unreal, because there's people
yeah,
who do believe this, and there's people who are good actors. So here we are. The WPATH standards of care document that's shaping laws and policies on so-called transgender healthcare, even for minors, for kids, seems to be more about politics and legal positioning than it is at all about medical science. So these accusations cut to the heart of what's at stake, the health and well-being of young people during this ongoing, what I would call cultural syndrome, aka gender mentalism.
sure.
So it's past time to ask questions about what's really driving this stuff. And of
Yeah,
course, we don't have to start that wheel because people like Jennifer Billick and Redux have been doing your religious God's work by going into the minds. But what's
right,
driving this? It's not science. It's not a scientific based process at all. But yet here we are, as if there is. I understand why there's cardiologists. I understand why
sure.
there's ear, nose, and throat people. Gender care,
Yeah, yeah,
gender surgeon,
right.
gender pediatric clinics. What is this?
Yeah. They have to invent a problem to fix it. They're such brazen liars. They deal in iatrogenic conditions. They make more trouble than they fix. Troublemakers.
Mhm.
Well, I don't have a good word to say about them, obviously. Not gonna
Yeah.
be getting any not gonna be getting any niceness from me.
Yeah.